Picture this. It's a cold October morning in 1396, and you're standing in Westminster Abbey watching the most shocking royal wedding England has ever witnessed. The groom is King Richard II, 29 years old, tall and regal, his golden hair catching the light filtering through those massive stained glass windows. But here's what makes your jaw drop. Walking beside him, her tiny hand completely swallowed by his gloved palm, is what can only be described as a child. She's barely 6 years old, this little French princess in her elaborate gown, her dark hair braided with pearls that seem almost too heavy for her small head to bear. This is Isabella of Valois, and she's about to become Queen of England. Now, I know what you're thinking, and trust me, even by medieval standards, this was absolutely wild. But before you click away thinking this is just another dark chapter of history, let me tell you something. Isabella's story isn't just about a child bride. It's about one of the most remarkable survivors in European history. A girl who would navigate 3 kingdoms, survive 2 marriages, and ultimately rewrite what it meant to have power as a woman in the medieval world. If you're fascinated by these hidden stories of incredible women who changed history, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're diving deep into tales that textbooks barely mention. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It absolutely blows my mind that we're exploring these ancient stories together from all corners of the globe, connected by our shared curiosity about the extraordinary lives that came before us. So let's go back to that wedding day. You have to understand, this wasn't some perverted arrangement by a twisted king. This was medieval diplomacy at its most calculated. Isabella's marriage to Richard was designed to end one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. For nearly 6 decades, England and France had been tearing each other apart. Villages lay in ruins, treasuries were empty, and entire generations had known nothing but warfare. Isabella was born into chaos. Her father, King Charles VI of France, suffered from bouts of what we'd now recognize as severe mental illness. Known to history as Charles the Mad, Isabella's childhood was spent watching her father transform from a loving parent into someone who believed he was made of glass and would shatter if he moved. Imagine being 5 years old and seeing your father, the most powerful man in your world, cowering in a corner because he's convinced assassins are coming for him, or standing motionless for hours because he thinks his body will break into 1,000 pieces. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, was desperately trying to hold the kingdom together while managing a husband who might not recognize her from one day to the next. And in this unstable, terrifying world, little Isabella was learning her first lesson in survival, that royal children weren't just daughters and sons. They were chess pieces in a game much larger than themselves. The idea of marrying Isabella to Richard emerged during secret negotiations in 1395. Richard had just lost his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, to plague. The English king was grief-stricken, but his advisors were panicking because he had no heir. Meanwhile, French ambassadors arrived with an offer that was audacious in its scope. Not just Isabella's hand in marriage, but a dowry of 800,000 francs and a 28-year truce. Here's what makes this even more incredible. When Richard saw the miniature portrait of 6-year-old Isabella, something in his expression softened. Court observers noted that the childless king seemed to see in this arrangement not just a political alliance, but the opportunity to be a father figure. The negotiations took months, with every detail of Isabella's future carefully planned. She would keep her French servants, practice French customs, and most importantly, the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity. When the wedding day arrived, Isabella was overwhelmed but not frightened. She was curious about the soaring Gothic arches, the flickering candles, the nobles in their finest silks and velvets. When Richard spoke his vows, his voice was gentle, almost protective. This wasn't a monster taking a child bride. This was a king trying to bring peace to 2. war-torn nations through the most sacred bond available to medieval rulers. The coronation a year later was absolutely spectacular. Isabella processed through London streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbolizing the union of two kingdoms. The crowds were so massive that several people died in the crush to see their famous child queen. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, and English duchesses carried her train, women who had been chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers. But here's where Isabella's story gets really fascinating. She thrived. Richard installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, with a carefully chosen household that mixed French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons in languages, courtly etiquette, and the complex social dynamics of English court life. Richard himself took an active interest in her education, visiting regularly and bringing gifts from across his realm. Exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's best artisans. Isabella quickly made friends with other children at court, particularly Margaret Holland, who was only 2 years older but seemed worldly and sophisticated. Margaret taught Isabella English games and helped her understand the subtle hierarchies of noble society. It was Margaret who explained why English nobles watched each other so carefully, why conversations shifted when Isabella appeared, and why even her French ladies-in-waiting chose their words carefully when discussing politics. The years 1397 and 1398 were peaceful for Isabella. She grew from a tiny child into a confident girl, her English becoming fluent, her understanding of court life sophisticated. The massive stone walls of Westminster became familiar rather than intimidating. Her education expanded beyond typical feminine accomplishments. Richard insisted she learn to read and write in both languages, and her tutors included some of the finest scholars in the kingdom. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor would spread great parchments across her study chamber floor, showing her the extent of both kingdoms. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing coastlines with her finger, understanding even at 8 years old that she embodied something larger than herself. She wasn't just learning to be a queen. She was a living symbol of peace between nations that have been enemies for generations. But symbols can be fragile things in the violent world of medieval politics. The first signs of trouble came in early 1399 when Isabella noticed changes in the court atmosphere. Conversations stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances. Even Margaret seemed anxious, though she tried to maintain their usual routines. The truth was devastating. Richard was facing the greatest crisis of his reign. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke had returned from exile with an army, claiming he'd come only to reclaim his inheritance, but clearly intending much more. English nobles who had long resented Richard's rule began flocking to Henry's banner. The stability that had allowed Isabella to feel safe was crumbling with terrifying speed. Isabella first realized how serious things were when she woke one morning to find several of her English ladies-in-waiting had disappeared during the night. By afternoon, she could hear shouting from the courtyard and saw armed men wearing unfamiliar colors. Margaret burst into Isabella's chambers that evening, her face pale with fear. "You must pack immediately," she whispered. "Only essential things. We're leaving Westminster tonight." The journey to the Tower of London was unlike anything Isabella had experienced. Instead of ceremonial processions, they traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy through dark streets. At the Tower, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable but clearly designed to contain rather than simply house their occupant. Windows were barred, guards stood at every entrance, and most of her English attendants were dismissed. When Richard came to see her, the change was shocking. The confident, kindly king was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her father's episodes. For the first time, Richard spoke to her not as a child to be sheltered, but as a political equal who needed to understand harsh realities. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that the future of both England and peace with France hung in the balance. When Isabella asked directly, "What will happen to me?" Richard admitted he didn't know. Henry might use her as a bargaining chip with her father, or he might honor their marriage and continue to protect her. The next few weeks passed in agonizing uncertainty until that gray October morning when Isabella heard heavy footsteps approaching her chambers. The doors opened to reveal new guards wearing Henry Bolingbroke's red rose livery. The man who entered behind them was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, come to meet the child who represented both opportunity and problem for his new reign. Isabella rose and curtsied deeply, as she'd been taught when meeting a king. Henry studied her, taking in her poise and obvious intelligence. "Your Grace," he said formally, still using her royal title, "I regret that circumstances have made it necessary to discuss your future under such conditions. What has become of the king?" Isabella asked with the directness that had become her hallmark. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. "He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne." Isabella knew enough about politics to understand abdicated likely meant was forced to give up the crown, but she didn't challenge the euphemism. What mattered was her immediate future, and that hung on Henry's assessment of how best to use the peace treaty with France. Henry's answer was chilling in its calculated ambiguity. "That depends on many factors. Your father's response to recent events, the advice of my counselors, and perhaps most importantly, your own conduct in the coming months." With those words, 9-year-old Isabella began the most dangerous period of her young life. She was no longer a child queen being raised to fulfill royal duties. She was a political prisoner, whose value might be measured against the cost of war or peace. The weeks following Richard's deposition became a masterclass in survival for Isabella. Some of Henry's supporters wanted her sent back to France immediately to avoid expense and signal England's readiness to renegotiate from strength. Others counseled caution, arguing that her presence gave England leverage. As long as she remained in English custody, her father would be reluctant to take actions that might endanger her welfare. Isabella played her part with remarkable skill. She was unfailingly polite to her captors, careful never to give offense while maintaining the dignity befitting her rank. She refused to be treated as anything less than the queen she legally remained. Her French ladies-in-waiting proved invaluable, helping her understand the delicate balance she needed to maintain. Then came devastating news. Richard was dead, allegedly from natural causes at Pontefract Castle. The whispers suggested Henry's supporters had arranged an accident. When Isabella received confirmation, the news hit her with unexpected force. She had never loved Richard as a wife loves a husband. How could she, when she was still a child? But he had been kind to her, had protected her, had been the closest thing to a father figure she'd known since leaving France. The manner of Richard's death carried ominous implications. If Henry was willing to arrange the murder of an anointed king, what scruples would he have about disposing of a French princess who had outlived her usefulness? In early 1400, Isabella received an ultimatum from Henry's government. She would be allowed to return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as rightful king and renounced any claims to the English throne as Richard's widow. For Isabella, the choice was stark: accept exile and acknowledge that her 3 years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse and risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. Her French advisors were divided, but ultimately the decision was made for her by events beyond her control. Charles VI, during one of his lucid periods, sent word that he expected his daughter to return immediately. Faced with the prospect of renewed war, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The journey back to France in summer 1401 was bittersweet. Isabella was leaving the only home she'd known for 5 years, abandoning apartments where she'd learned English poetry, gardens where she'd played with Margaret Holland, the great hall where she'd been crowned. At the same time, she was returning to a family and country that had become foreign to her. She now spoke French with a slight English accent and had to relearn the etiquette of her father's court. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's deteriorating condition. Charles was in the midst of one of his worst episodes, convinced invisible enemies were pursuing him and refusing to recognize his own family. Her mother, Isabel, was more welcoming but also calculating, immediately considering how Isabella's unique position might advance French interests. Isabella found herself caught between competing demands. She was French by birth, but had also been Queen of England. When her mother's advisors questioned her about English defenses or Henry's support, she answered carefully, providing general information while avoiding details that might be used for military campaigns. At 11, Isabella had already experienced more upheaval than most people encountered in a lifetime. She was no longer a child, but not yet fully adult. Her status as former Queen of England made her an attractive marriage prospect, but also complicated potential matches. Some suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political significance. Others were more interested in political advantages than Isabella herself. The French court of 1401 was dangerous for someone with Isabella's complex loyalties. Anti-English sentiment ran high, and Isabella's years as Queen of England made some courtiers view her with suspicion. She had to avoid appearing too sympathetic to English interests, while not betraying the genuine affection she'd felt for Richard and his supporters. Her mother Isabel proved both protector and potential threat. The Queen of France genuinely cared for Isabella's welfare, but was also a sophisticated political operator who saw her daughter's experiences as valuable resources for the crown. Protection came with expectations that Isabella would serve French interests, even when those conflicted with her own convictions. In 1402, word arrived that Henry was facing serious rebellions in England. Some at the French court argued this was an opportunity to invade and restore the rightful dynasty, possibly with Isabella playing a symbolic role. Isabella was horrified by these discussions. Regardless of her feelings about Henry's usurpation, the English people she'd known, her servants, tutors, childhood companions, were innocent of their ruler's political crimes. The idea of French armies ravaging English villages in her name was deeply disturbing. When directly asked about potential military action, Isabella chose her words carefully, pointing out that invasion would likely result in massive casualties on both sides, that the English might rally to defend their homeland regardless of their feelings about Henry, and that success was far from guaranteed, given England's natural defenses and military traditions. These political tensions came to a head in 1403, when Isabella was approached with a marriage proposal that would dramatically change her life. Charles, Duke of Orleans, was Isabella's cousin and one of the most powerful nobles in France. At 29, he was exactly the same age Richard had been when he married Isabella. But this time, the age gap seemed less significant since Isabella was now approaching 14. The proposed marriage was attractive from several perspectives. It would keep Isabella within the French royal family, preventing her from becoming a diplomatic asset for foreign powers. It would also align her with one of the most cultured courts in Europe, as Charles was known as a patron of arts and literature, as well as a capable military commander. For Isabella personally, the match offered the prospect of marriage based on mutual respect rather than pure political calculation. She had met Charles several times during childhood, and he had always treated her with courtesy and kindness. More importantly, he was experienced enough to be a true partner rather than another guardian figure. When Isabella first met with Charles to discuss marriage seriously, she was struck by how different he was from Richard. Where Richard had been gentle and somewhat otherworldly, Charles was passionate and intensely engaged with the world around him. He spoke to her not as a child to be protected, but as an equal whose opinions and experiences mattered. "I want you to understand," he told her during one private conversation that I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I am seeking to marry Isabella of Valois, the remarkable young woman who survived the courts of 2 kingdoms and emerged with her dignity intact. Isabella found herself genuinely attracted to Charles in a way she'd never experienced. At 14, she was no longer a child, and the feelings stirring within her were those of a young woman discovering her own desires. Charles was handsome, cultured, and intelligent, but more importantly, he seemed to see her as an individual rather than merely a political asset. The wedding took place in June 1406 at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, a ceremony that deliberately contrasted with Isabella's first marriage. This celebration was a grand spectacle designed to demonstrate French royal power. Isabella, now 16, wore a gown of deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, her dark hair crowned with a circlet of sapphires and pearls. She walked down the aisle with confidence, no longer the frightened child married to a stranger, but a young woman choosing her own path. The early years of Isabella's marriage to Charles were among the happiest of her life. Charles proved not only a devoted husband, but an intellectual companion who shared her interests in literature, music, and arts. His court at Blois became a center of cultural refinement, attracting poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe. Isabella threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm. She patronized troubadours, commissioned illuminated manuscripts, established a scriptorium where monks copied important texts, and maintained correspondence with scholars throughout Europe. Her experiences in England had given her a unique perspective on European culture, and she used this knowledge to foster intellectual exchange between French and foreign courts. The couple's first child, a daughter named Joan, was born in 1407. Isabella approached motherhood with characteristic intensity, determined to be more present than her own mother had been during the chaos of her father's reign. She insisted on nursing the baby herself, despite court physicians' protests. Holding her daughter for the first time, Isabella felt profound completion. This child would grow up knowing parental love and protection, free from the political machinations that had shaped Isabella's own childhood. But even as Isabella enjoyed domestic happiness, the larger world continued to intrude. The growing tension within France itself, as the king's mental illness created a power vacuum that noble factions were eager to fill, would soon shatter her newfound peace. Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, was one of the most ambitious nobles claiming the right to govern during Charles VI's periods of incapacity. This claim was disputed by the Duke of Burgundy, and the rivalry between Orleans and Burgundian factions would eventually tear France apart. In November 1407, Louis of Orleans was assassinated on the streets of Paris by agents of the Duke of Burgundy. The murder was carried out with shocking boldness, killers striking down the king's brother in broad daylight before disappearing into the maze of medieval streets. The assassination transformed Isabella's life overnight. Charles, who inherited his father's titles and responsibilities, was now one of France's most powerful men, but also a marked target. The Duke of Burgundy had demonstrated his willingness to use violence against enemies, and the Orleans family was now his primary target. Isabella found herself thrust into a world of bodyguards and constant vigilance. Her movements were restricted for security, correspondence was monitored, and the carefree atmosphere of their court at Blois was replaced by the grim reality of civil war. Charles himself was transformed by his father's murder. The cultured, artistic young man Isabella had married began showing a harder edge, driven by desire for vengeance that sometimes frightened her. He gathered allies and resources for what everyone knew would be a long, bloody conflict with the Burgundian faction. The birth of Isabella's second child, a son named Charles, in 1408, provided brief respite from political tensions. The arrival of a male heir strengthened the Orleans' claim to eventual French leadership, but also made Isabella's family an even more attractive target for enemies. Isabella, approached her son's upbringing with even greater care. Drawing on her experiences at the English court, she ensured he learned multiple languages, studied histories of various European kingdoms, and developed diplomatic skills essential to his future role. The early Civil War years were marked by battles and sieges that gradually exhausted both sides. Isabella found herself managing family territories while Charles campaigned, a responsibility requiring her to master complex logistics of medieval warfare and governance. She proved surprisingly adept, using diplomatic skills to maintain alliances and organizational abilities to ensure supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's forces. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who had fully embraced her role as political leader, no longer the confused child shuffled between courts, but a mature woman controlling her own destiny. The war took a devastating toll on France. Entire regions were laid waste by competing armies, trade was disrupted, and common people suffered from depredations of soldiers from both sides. Isabella used her position to provide relief where possible, establishing charitable foundations and negotiating safe passage for refugees fleeing the worst fighting. The birth of Isabella's third child, daughter Marguerite, in 1409, was both joy and anxiety source. Isabella was now 20, and repeated pregnancies were taking a toll on her health. She approached this pregnancy with particular care, following the best medical advice available and preparing detailed instructions for her children's care in case something happened to her. These preparations proved prescient, as complications during Marguerite's birth nearly cost Isabella her life. For several days after delivery, Isabella hovered between life and death, her body weakened by blood loss and infection. The possibility she might die forced both Isabella and Charles to confront the fragility of their happiness and the uncertain future facing their children. Isabella's recovery was slow and incomplete. The birth had damaged her health in ways that would affect her for life, leaving her weakened and susceptible to various illnesses. More immediately, physicians warned that another pregnancy would likely kill her, advice that profoundly affected her relationship with Charles. Despite these challenges, Isabella and Charles's marriage remained strong. They found new ways to express their love and partnership, focusing on shared interests in culture and politics. Isabella became even more involved in governing their territories, effectively serving as Charles's co-ruler while he campaigned. Isabella's health continued deteriorating throughout 1411 and 1412. The damage from Marguerite's birth left her vulnerable to respiratory infections, and she suffered from chronic fatigue that made daily activities increasingly difficult. She began spending more time in contemplation and prayer, perhaps sensing her time was limited. Despite physical weaknesses, Isabella remained mentally sharp and emotionally engaged with family and responsibilities. She continued overseeing her children's education, managing political affairs, and pursuing cultural interests. Her determination to live fully despite health problems inspired those around her. Isabella faced the prospect of death with the same courage she'd shown throughout her life. She made careful provisions for her children's future, ensuring they would be protected and educated regardless of what happened. She also worked to secure her husband's faction's political position, understanding that her death might create opportunities for enemies. Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 1409, at age 20. She had lived a life spanning 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, experiencing both the heights of royal power and depths of political uncertainty. Her death was mourned throughout Europe, not just by family and subjects, but by many people whose lives she touched through kindness and wisdom. The funeral cortege that carried Isabella's body to its final resting place at the Celestin convent in Paris was one of the largest seen in medieval France. Representatives from across Europe came to pay respects to a woman who had embodied the complex interactions between personal courage and political necessity that characterized her age. Isabella's legacy extended far beyond immediate political consequences of her death. She had demonstrated that even in an age when women were expected to be passive political assets, it was possible for a determined individual to carve out space for independent action and moral leadership. Her life story became a source of inspiration for other women facing similar challenges. Modern historians sometimes struggle to understand Isabella's story, caught between admiration for her achievements and discomfort with circumstances that shaped her life. The marriage of a 6-year-old to a 29-year-old violates contemporary sensibilities about childhood and consent, even when we understand the political necessities driving such arrangements. But to judge Isabella's world by modern standards is to miss the profound humanity of her story. She was born into a system treating royal children as diplomatic assets, but managed to transcend those limitations and create a life of genuine meaning and accomplishment. Her marriages, whatever their origins, became partnerships based on mutual respect and affection. Looking back across centuries, we see in Isabella's life both the limitations and possibilities that have always characterized human existence. She was constrained by expectations of her age and gender, but found ways to exercise agency and make meaningful contributions to the world around her. Her story is ultimately one of resilience, intelligence, and the refusal to accept that personal happiness and political responsibility are mutually exclusive. Isabella's story reminds us that every age has its own moral complexities, and the people of the past, however different their world may seem, shared our fundamental human needs for love, security, and purpose. To understand her life is to understand something essential about the human condition, that we are all products of our time, yet capable of transcending the limitations that time imposes.